All right, welcome back to Psychedelics today, everybody. Today we're joined with Dr. Sam Gandy, scientific assistant at the Beckley Foundation, Research Foundation, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, super excited to have you here.
thanks for having me. Great to be on.
Yeah. Cool. So can you give the listeners a little background about how you got into psychedelics and what you do?
Um, so interesting psychedelics. So I think that kind of goes back a decade and a half, back to the sort of heady days in London where at the time, you could purchase psilocybin mushrooms completely legally. So that was a kind of lucky quirk of timing, being in the right place at the right time. I was always kind of a little bit, I guess, anti drugs of all type until I kind of discovered psychedelics. I was like, okay, there's something really quite interesting here. And I kind of, I grew sort of really interested in consciousness and kind of exploring that, not just through psychedelics, but through other means as well. And psychedelics were kind of part of that. And so my big other sort of life passion is nature. I've always had a massive connection to and interest in nature and wildlife, and that kind of channeled that into an academic career, and did a master's in entomology, did a Ph.D. in ecology, and now I work here at the Beckley Foundation. And the Beckley is a think tank and charitable trust sort of geared towards instigating and funding research into psychedelics and cannabinoids. And it's played quite a pivotal role in sort of, engaging on that front here in the UK and elsewhere in the world. So that's really interesting in that I've kind of, with my background sort of more ecology, I've kind of come into this world of psychedelics. And it's interesting in that although they might seem quite different, one way of thinking about it is like ecology is essentially the science of interconnection, of the interconnection of life. And psychedelics give you direct experiential sort of experience of that interconnection. So I do see that they're related in that sense. One's a kind of intellectual understanding, one's sort of experiential. And the other thing is, the interesting capacity of psychedelics to increase human nature connection or relatedness. And that has very important implications for the individual and society. And I guess we'll talk more about that maybe, but that's a sort of particular interest of mine, I would say, within the psychedelic sort of research sphere.
Yeah, awesome. I think it's such an important topic and conversation. I know Joe's really passionate about this as well. Really follows I mean, I think he did a little bit stuff in permaculture. He just has a really high interest in ecology and just the world in general. So, and it's important, right? Because we're kind of heading into a time of what's happening, right?
No, very, very much so. Quite a few people sort of think that we're headed for collapse of human civilization within this century if we go on our current course, if we carry on business as usual. So any means through which we can sort of and I see the ecological crisis that we face, it's a side effect of our disconnection from nature. So it's a sort of an extension from that, and we really need to remedy that. We really deeply need to reconnect to nature. There was an interesting report recently, big sort of multi-governmental, multinational report on the state of biodiversity and ecology in the world, and it found that land sort of under the surveillance or sort of occupied by indigenous people is pretty much the only land occupied by humans that isn't degrading in any way. And all indigenous people, some of them obviously use psychedelics, but not all of them do. But the one sort of commonality they share is this: they're very, very profoundly connected to nature and their ecology. And we in the West, we're not. That's, I think, being part of the price of our sort of materialistic technological development, is we've lost that connection to the natural world, and as a result, we seem more prone to degrading and destroying it, both to its loss and ours. So I see this kind of remedying of our natural nature disconnection as something very, very important if we want a future.
Yeah, yeah. And I think in your TED talk, you kind of described it as a crisis of human connection. And I find that just so interesting because we live in such a time where we're so connected virtually and digitally.
Yeah,
And it's like kind of what's going on there. It's like we
it's
crave this connection. We have it, right? Through this,
yes, and we've
but
replaced it with something else that's sort of like, for sure, like very convenient. I mean, like, we're able to talk now on the other side of the world to each other through this technology, which is fantastic, and I'm certainly not knocking it. It's amazing and got amazing power, but it's interesting in that it seems that this sort of nature disconnection it's inversely proportional to our technological connection. So obviously we've been urbanizing and increasingly living in cities and sort of more away from nature, but it seems this nature disconnect may have kind of accelerated from the 1950s onwards, and it really seems that that's more linked to the rise of technology into our lives. So computer and video games and the internet now increasingly. And it seems, as the more kind of technologically interconnected we become, we sort of increasingly lose our nature connection, unfortunately. And that should be something we should be very mindful of, because that has serious implications for us as individuals and sort of the wider environment.
yeah, do you have any, I guess, beliefs or maybe opinions about if we continue on this trend? Like, where could you see us in 10, 15, 20 years? I mean, it just seems like it's
Um,
accelerating so quickly, and I guess that's why I did the shorter range.
yeah,
Yeah.
sure. I mean, some scientists think we are, within the next sort of few decades, we're going to be in quite deep trouble with climate change alone, without considering any of the other environmental issues we face. Like climate changes will make life harder for many of us. So I want to be wary about making sort of too many predictions, in that sort of like I'm generally like quite a positive person, but I'm also, and I'm not, probably my friends would say gratingly so. But I am, deeply concerned about our future as a species on this planet. I do really think we're headed for trouble, for serious trouble, and that concerns me. But also, we're not always particularly wise as a species, despite our Latin name, which then that translates to. But we are quite intelligent and adaptable and resourceful. And like there is this increased sort of awareness there's some interesting research, I think, published quite recently. Like we're beginning to realize how fundamentally important nature is to our health and well-being. And like part of my hope is like, for not everyone's interested in nature for its own sake or wants to protect it for its own sake. A lot of people have quite a narrow focus and priority, like being alive on this planet. And my hope is that as this sort of awareness and knowledge sort of spreads a bit more, people, even for our own self-interest, will realize how important nature is. Like we can't live without it. It can't just be, there's got to be room for all the other life going on out there, as well as the life that directly serves us, like our crops and our livestock and stuff like that. So who knows? I think there is an increasing growing awareness of sort of the importance of this nature connection, and also just connection on a broad sense as well, like community connection to other people. So we'll see what happens. There's an interesting mix of different competing forces in the mix right now.
Yeah, yeah, it's really. I mean, I guess it's something I think about often. And you made a comment in your TED talk about screen obsession, and this kind of popped in my head that I used to work with at-risk teenagers and worked with like a college population and mental health services, and just seeing like the impact it has on that children and teenagers and young
Yeah.
adults. And I always kind of wonder like what type of impact this is going to have on the future generations.
Yeah. It's a very good, it's an interesting point in terms of like, we're kind of part of a big experiment now without any real control group, in terms of like how like technology and the internet is interfacing with our brain and changing it. And it seems like from like research that's been conducted, like not claiming to know that much about it, but it seems like it is changing our brains, and our sort of attention spans are being impacted. And like we know that sort of looking at a white screen for a long time, you know, elevates cortisol, like stress hormones. So it's definitely having an effect on our psychology and physiology, even if we don't think about it or notice it. Like there are consequences for our screen addictions, definitely. Yeah, something to be aware of.
Yeah, I think I was watching a documentary about this at one of my residencies, and during the documentary, they were saying a lot of like adolescents and young adults are kind of missing these huge milestones, like not getting driver's license or maybe not getting jobs and leaving the house. And you know, some of the argument was, you know, I could have my whole social life here. I don't need to leave. I can play
Yeah,
video games, and so it's
yeah,
like,
yeah,
what does
yeah.
that do with even like nature connection, not being able to, or not wanting to go outside and be connected
Yeah.
and play outside? It's just all right here in front of us all the
No, it's a very good point. I think there's an interesting. I've heard someone say, I thought was an interesting point. It's like we've managed through our technology, we've killed boredom, which might sound positive, but it's maybe not. Because you know, like back in like a few decades ago, or not that long ago, like you wanted to go and have fun, you'd have to go and make fun, you'd have to go outside and like meet up with your friends and like go on adventures and do stuff and get your hands grubby and sort of, you know, go exploring. And like now you don't need to do that, because you've got like games and gadgets, and you've got sort of stuff to kind of entertain you right in your living room, bedroom, and you don't need to go anywhere to be entertained. You don't have to think creatively to make your own fun or adventures. And so yeah, I think that's a sort of like technology's kind of given us a sort of like silver spoon that's too easy to kind of access and sort of ladle to ourselves. And that's kind of, you know, there's the saying like contentment is the enemy of invention. So you know, there's a cost to that convenience.
Yeah, and you know, bridging this with psychedelics, I think it's so interesting with this kind of psychedelic renaissance, or just all the research that's starting to start back up, and everything that's coming out, and how quick it's accelerating. Thinking about the two in the sense of connection. You know, people talk about oneness and feeling connected on psychedelics,
Yes,
and then you have the internet and all this technology that has us connected, and
yes,
it's just a really interesting thing that's kind of growing together. And
yeah,
what's
yeah.
going on there, right? It's almost like
No, it's
psychedelics an antidote, or like
no,
balancing.
no, it's funny. Yeah, the yin and the yang are kind of like, yeah, growing alongside. No, it is a very interesting point. I mean, so partly, I mean, it's interesting. Tim Leary was very much of an advocate of the internet, like sort of way back. He was like one of the first, very early sort of person to say like the internet is the LSD of the future. You know, in terms of connection and being interconnected. This is and he was kind of, I think back then people were like, yeah, whatever, Tim. Like, but he was like, you know, he was quite sort of, yeah, forward thinking and visionary in what he was saying. And like, you know, he was one of the, I think maybe had one of the earliest kind of websites or something. Like, yeah, he was quite sort of a trendsetter in that regard. But also the internet now, because we've got all this information that's so accessible, I think the internet's playing very much a pivotal role in the psychedelic renaissance, in terms of people having access to all this knowledge. For instance, like I think it was the Johns Hopkins NYU research, on the psilocybin for treatment of existential anxiety in terminally ill cancer patients. And I think the articles, there was a few sort of, there's some media coverage of those studies, and I think in total they garnered a total of a billion online views.
Wow.
So that's like that is so sort of impactful and far reaching in terms of getting out there. So yeah, I do. So although they're kind of like, in a sense, like, yeah, the technology or the internet, the psychedelics competing, they're also sort of synergizing in an
Yeah.
interesting way as well, I think.
And I think Terence McKenna used to talk a lot about the internet too. I remember listening to a lot of his old talks, and
Yeah,
you know,
Yeah. Okay.
how much stuff really, like psychedelics and the internet, how have they been like co-evolving over
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know? It's
No,
interesting.
that's cool. Yeah, no, no, it is interesting. And it's kind of like, it'll be interesting to sort of see how things evolve as well. I mean, it's interesting, like I'm sort of writing a paper right now with some colleagues from Imperial College, and we're sort of the data we're using is online. It's a psychedelic survey.org, I think. So it's kind of, yeah, we're using the internet to source our data for the research we're doing. So in that sense, it's being a useful aid to the research we're doing as well. So no, there's definitely some positives of the internet and how it links to all this stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I didn't want to just highlight all the
No, no, no. I think it's good to
just for
be.
the conversation of nature and disconnecting. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
to be
no,
able to do this, I mean, I love it, you know, just being able to share
yeah,
information and to be able to connect to people. I think it's wonderful. And it
yeah,
kind of comes back to balance, right? How are we using it? It's a tool. We can
exactly.
really
Yeah,
overindulge in it, or
exactly. I mean, some people I know are, well, might be sort of technologically phobic from the outset, but it's like, technology is not good or bad. It's how it's used. It's the intent sort of behind it that makes it a positive or a negative thing. So that's something to keep in mind, I think. Yeah.
so besides, I guess, the technology aspect, do you think there has been anything else that's played a role in this disconnecting from nature?
So I mean, I think it probably started way back when we domesticated like plants and animals. I think when we stopped being hunter gatherers
Mm,
and started becoming farmers, I think that was the first step away from being part of nature, because it completely changes the mindset. Like when you're hunter gathering, you're very much embedded and part of the environment you're actively exploring and sort of looking for your resources, and you're sort of harvesting them in a kind of, a sustainable way. Whereas when you're growing things, you want to sort of you want to produce a particular species to the detriment of any other species that might be in the way of that species. So it very much, it's a fundamental change in how you relate to the wider environment once you start doing that. So, and I think that was the first big step. And it's an interesting thing to think about. Like, it was particularly grasses, like the humble grasses crops, like rice and wheat and oats, all these grasses we've domesticated over millennia and are an important part of our food source. Like, they sort of, once we started doing that on a grand level, we started, for the first time, we started living in cities. We were no longer living in a hunter gatherer situation that's sort of low population density spread over wide areas. We started all, for the first time in our species history, we started living in large groups in cities. And because of that, there was suddenly, like, we had more time on our hands, and there was like division of labor. And like, it seems that, like, culture and the arts and religion and other things kind of followed it to some degree in the wake of that. So it radically transformed our civilization. Well, that's the roots of our civilization lie in that, in fact, I think. So I think that was the first big step. I think urbanization is playing a part. So about, I think it's 52% of humans live in cities now, and I think by 2050, the UN predicts it's going to be like, I think, 76%. So we're becoming increasingly urbanized, and people are moving away from sort of rural living environments where they're more likely to encounter nature. And then sort of technology is the most recent wave, I guess, that's sort of disconnecting us more from nature.
yeah. I guess, studying ecology for a while. Do you think these? I mean, I guess parts of these trends are healthy, being able to live in cities, conveniency, culture, and stuff
Yeah,
like that. But I mean, I guess to balance that out, like if we are in this, like, I don't know, this era of possible like climate change crisis and whatnot, like where do you think like the balance could be? How people could shift, I guess, like culture, their values or way of living?
Yeah, I think it's easier said than done, but
For sure. Yeah.
I think we need to, what we need to do, I feel, is we need to transition to, essentially we need to transition to an ecological civilization of some kind, where nature, that I guess like laws, that there needs to be like much more sort of like legal protection against for nature, against ecocide. Preservation of nature is like, would hopefully be one of the sort of dominant um, principles of such a civilization. And sustainability would be, long-term sustainability would be sort of like the chief governing principle about how things are ran. So it would take a substantial kind of reshuffling of our economic system. Like, I think it would need a complete overhaul, really, in order. I don't know, capitalism in its current form. I don't know if it's actually compatible with that, because of like the short-term greed and power lust that comes into play is just like the antithesis of what I've just said in terms of
Right.
this new ecological approach. So yeah, it's going to be tough, but I see it as, we either make the change, and it might be hard sort of doing that transition, but ultimately I think people will be happier and healthier in the long run for doing so, or we will carry on our current course, and nature will check us. And when nature does that, so we either check ourselves and become one with nature, or nature will step in, probably brutally, because of our ecological degradation that we've caused, and like ecosystem degradation or collapse will be inflicted upon us, and that will be probably quite horrific. So they're the two main options, or the paths that I think we can take.
And do you see psychedelics as being like a big catalyst for change? Or...
Yeah, no, I think they could definitely play an important role. So we know, so the research that's coming in so far, there's already a lot of correlative research to say that psychedelics increase nature connection or relatedness. And independent psychological research has found like one's degree of nature connection or relatedness is the single strongest predictor of pro-environmental, pro-ecological behavior. So that's really important. On the other hand, if you scale it down to the individual, one's degree of nature connection is highly correlated with a number of really positive psychological health parameters. So well-being, happiness, vitality, positive effect, decreased anxiety, low anxiety. So it's a really good thing. Like the more you can nature connected you feel, the sort of better mental shape and likely physical shape you're going to be in. But it also predicts one's care for their wider environment. And so being in nature on its own, like you definitely don't need psychedelics to increase nature relatedness. Simply being in nature will have that effect. But, not everyone is naturally inclined or sort of interested in nature, I guess. Particularly if you've been disconnected from it all your life, you might not simply know what you're missing.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing I think that's quite interesting and radical about psychedelics, and I know a few anecdotal case studies in this regard, is that I think the power of the psychedelics is that they can kind of convert the skeptics to being part of nature. Do you know what I mean? So you're less preaching to the choir. You can actually bring in new people to the fold, and their perspectives can be changed. There's a quote about, I think, attributed to Albert Einstein, like, you're not going to fix a problem with the same level of consciousness that created it in the first place.
Right.
Like psychedelics sort of are valuable in that they can give this kind of sort of this expanded view of levity on our problems, on our issues that we face. So I do see them as like important allies and catalysts in this regard, definitely.
Yeah. And what do you think about the psychedelic experience kind of potentiates the wanting to be more in touch with nature, or more ecological awareness? Like what do you think's going on there?
So it's interesting. Like, so I guess the research still sort of ongoing, but it really seems from a few studies that have been kind of conducted like correlative studies, it seems that it's the ego dissolution aspect of psychedelics that seem a really important part of this. So if you have enough of a dose of a psychedelic and your ego, your default mode network, where sort of fundamental component of where your ego or sense of self is thought to reside, that kind of becomes relaxed, and eventually it will sort of be dissolved temporarily. And when that happens, it seems there's a breakdown in the perceived boundaries between self and other break down, and that facilitates this kind of expanded self-nature overlap. And it seems that is perhaps the sort of the core facet of the psychedelic experience. It's that dissolution of boundaries. And there's a state of like oceanic boundlessness that's sort of also measured, at least as part of the surveys they use in the Imperial and other research teams' experiences. So, and that this oceanic boundlessness appears sort of linked to this feeling of external unity with the world. So when you kind of feel part of it, it sort of changes fundamentally how you relate to it. And that's an interesting thing, because they found this, I read an interesting paper recently, and it found that one's environmental knowledge, so one's knowledge of nature, is a very weak predictor of one's concern for nature. So just because you know a lot about it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to care for or protect it. And the study found that one's nature relatedness or connection was 30 times stronger at predicting pro-environmental behavior. So you've got to have that emotional, empathic connection to nature. And that's what the psychedelics seems to be really quite good at. And that's why they're important, I think.
Interesting. I mean, I guess that makes sense, right? To be kind of more emotionally attached versus like observing, be like, oh, well, I know that. And
yes, it's the kind of, again, it's like the science of ecology versus the experiential experience of interconnection. I mentioned it's like there's a difference between an intellectual understanding of something and a direct experiential felt experience of something. Even if they're the same thing, it's very different to experience something directly with your core being than having a kind of detached intellectual understanding of it, I think.
Yeah. So I believe you mentioned that psilocybin was probably the most researched in this area with nature connection.
Yes, it seems so. Yeah. I think that's partly, I mean, that's really purely because psilocybin right now is kind of leading the charge in terms of the psychedelics. Like LSD still has cultural, political baggage from the 60s attached to it. Like one of the researchers said, it's also like psilocybin's a lot harder to spell. So it's kind of gone a bit more under the radar. I think it's less threatening to people, certainly to like regulatory governmental funding agencies it is. So I think it's just a byproduct of that it's been the current focus of the psychedelic research renaissance. And I'm sure the other psychedelics will have their day in due course. I mean, it was interesting, my friend, I think you spoke to David Luke recently, and he did an interesting survey study looking at the various different classical psychedelics and other substances. And he looked at nature connection, and then environmental concern. And psilocybin mushrooms definitely came top of the pile in both terms of both connection and concern increase. So yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting. So they seem sort of like perhaps maybe the most sort of pro-ecological nature connection enhancing agents that we have available.
Huh, that's interesting. Did anybody else from that study report ayahuasca?
So it was interesting. Ayahuasca, I think it came second for increasing concern, and maybe third or fourth after LSD for increasing connection. And I thought, I mean, we'd need to like do more research, I guess, needs to be done before we can speculate on that. But my sort of, I guess, hunch on that is when people take mushrooms or LSD, you tend to often go outside into nature and explore.
Right.
So the nature is part of the setting that you're having that experience in. ayahuasca tends to be quite strictly controlled, the setting that you have. You tend to be in a maloca or an indoor environment, and you're not really encouraged to go outside in nature. I mean, I when I drank ayahuasca in Peru, and the shaman leading the session said, like, you know, when you go to the loo, whatever, like, come straight back. Don't hang around outside. You've got to be in here so I can keep an eye on you. So it was kind of actively discouraged to go and like check out, to go and be in nature. So I wonder if that's part of it. And I wonder maybe, like, I think the research, the survey sort of research I'm looking at now, it seems that, as you might expect, the setting, having access to a nature-based setting, does have a sort of big impact on one's experience and how connected to nature they feel.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about. Like, just thinking about like people's recreational experiences, maybe eating mushrooms or taking LSD and going out in nature versus this more kind of ceremonial context, which...
Yes. I mean, what fascinates me actually as well is that the psilocybin research that's been done so far, you know, it's all been in very clinical settings, like, you know, cozy. Obviously these researchers know the whole importance of set and setting. So, you know, people aren't just in sterile rooms; they're in cozy, nice, decked out pads that have been, you know, converted from. But there's no research because of like the regulatory legal issues around sort of like psychedelic research. We're not really seeing, apart from like some naturalistic studies that are going on, there's not much research going on in actual natural settings.
Right.
So hopefully, as things advance and maybe laws and stuff kind of like loosen up a little bit, there'll be more research using psychedelics in more natural environments. I think that would be really good to see.
You think that would be hard to kind of do that through clinical research, or do you think it would be more through like surveys and...
Yeah, well, I think for right now, there's survey studies going on, so that's a really good way of sort of like trying to measure this. And there's some naturalistic studies where researchers are kind of going on and doing some observational research of people partaking psychedelics in more natural settings. So I think we're probably some way off before sort of nature-based themes will be incorporated into clinical settings, but hopefully there will be change. I mean, it's interesting. I just heard recently, I was speaking to someone from Vice recently, and this guy at Yale, Matthias Forstmann, who wrote a really interesting paper a few years ago, showing that the increase in nature relatedness that psychedelics can catalyze increases one's pro-environmental behavior. Like, it's linked to that, and no other drugs did that. It was a unique property of the psychedelics, classical psychedelics. But he's now interested. So it was a great study, but as he himself, as they said in the paper, is a correlative study. So although it looked like there was definitely a psychedelic, they couldn't like definitively say it was a cause and effect. Like, you take a psychedelic and it's like maybe you're just more nature related people are drawn to psychedelics in the first place, and maybe there is a bit of a two-way thing. But he's now doing a clinical trial, I think, at Yale with psychedelic naive people, so I've heard. So they can compare a before and after the experience, so they will be able to show a cause and effect. And that's what's lacking from the research right now. There's quite a bit of correlative research, but we want to like look at the sort of like potential cause and effect. And there's some research going on now at Imperial that I'm really interested in, that's looking at high dose psilocybin in healthy psychedelic naive people who've never taken a psychedelic before, and looking at the what happens in the brain and what happens to their sort of personality, outlook, well-being scores. And that will be quite exciting to see.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think Dr. David Luke even brought that up, like, you know, psychedelics might be more associated with these like, quote unquote, like hippie movements, people just like more into nature in a sense. And what would it be like to be able to take something that's totally psychedelic naive and maybe kind of detached from nature and see how that actually shifts things? I think that's really important.
No, I really think so. I mean, it's fascinating in terms of there's really great potential here in terms of sort of the potential applications in the future. I mean, hopefully, like, there will be kind of law changes. Like right now in the UK, at least, it's very strict. Like psilocybin in particular is a Schedule 1 Class A substance, so it's much harder to access and use for doctors and researchers than methamphetamine or cocaine or diamorphine, heroin. It's extremely strictly controlled, which doesn't really make sense given like its low toxicity and its lack of addiction retention and all these potential medical therapeutic properties it has. But as things sort of like loosen up a bit and it hopefully will become more accessible, I'm fascinated by the potential of sort of nature reconnection therapy and sort of like giving people like a kind of toolbox of different methods and techniques and practices with which people can reconnect with nature, and they can kind of pick and mix and choose whatever resonates with them. But hopefully in the future, psychedelics will have a place as part of that, I think.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I always really was fascinating by like rites of passages and being able to do like kind of like eco therapy type things with rites of
Yeah,
psychedelics. I think there's possible like huge potential there.
yeah.
Just even that idea of like disconnecting from nature or whatnot, like some of those rites of passages were so built into nature, right? Like the mythology and
Yeah,
cosmology is passed down through that, and through your experience you start to embody it and really understand.
yeah. No, I think that's a good point. I think, because we kind of, as you were saying earlier, like we kind of lack much sort of real rites of passage type sort of scenarios that obviously are a major part of indigenous cultures. And we've sort of lost that. I mean, it's interesting. I should say it's like this increase in nature relatedness that's reported. It's not a fleeting thing that occurs only under the effect of the psychedelics. So research on people at Imperial found that like when they surveyed them like 7 to 12 months later, they still rated pretty much as highly, I think, for nature relatedness as immediately after the experience. And then so another research group led by Franz Vollenweider, he sort of amalgamated psilocybin studies on healthy people, and he found that I think it was like 38% of them reported enduring changes in their relationships to the environment, and that was I think 12 to 16 months later. And I don't think they surveyed them after that, but this seems to be like a long-term enduring shift in people's perspectives, catalyzed by this single or a few experiences. So this is something that really stays with people, and that's important to say. It's not just like a fleeting insight that sort of like vanishes once the effects of the substance kind of wear off.
Right. Yeah, it's so interesting with a lot of this research and you seeing the like prolonged effects over time. It's not just like really short, some
Yeah,
of this research is, 16, 12 months. And then with the MDMA
yeah,
stuff in the early years, it was like, 3.4 years after their MDMA didn't meet post-traumatic stress disorder
yeah.
criteria. It's really interesting on how
No,
it
it's
really
and
elicits
how
long-term change.
Yeah, no, it is fascinating, and there's and another thing that's interesting in that regard is openness. I'm sure
Yeah.
you've heard like psilocybin can increase openness, the personality trait openness, and as well as that being linked to imagination and appreciation for aesthetics and hunger for knowledge and new experiences, it also strongly correlates with nature connection and separately pro-environmental behavior. It's like one of the main personality predictors of that. So it's like there's an entourage effect. So interesting, the Forstmann paper I mentioned earlier, they controlled for personality traits. So, but yet they still found this. So through the psychedelics, you're getting this long-term increase in openness, and you're getting this long-term increase in nature relatedness, and both seem to be kind of synergizing in a similar way, which is interesting.
Yeah. So I know Hoffman talked about how LSD really enhanced his appreciation for nature. And, kind of makes me wonder, and I wonder about your opinions between some of the animistic qualities of, say, psilocybin and plant medicines versus some of these synthetics. It'd be really interesting to see like the differences there in research, and do some of these more animistic kind of spiritual experiences from these plant medicines actually elicit more of a connection with nature versus
Yeah, that's a
LSD.
That's a good question. It's an interesting question, and so yes, so it's worth just commenting on Albert Hoffman. So he he prior to his discovery of LSD, when he occasionally had a few experiences while I was walking in nature, and he had these mystical experiences, as he refers to them, and of like feelings of deep unity, connection, wonder, awe at the natural world. And he said later, when he sampled LSD, it gave him that same sense of unity, of interconnection with the natural world. He said it was an identical feeling, which I think is interesting. And yeah, like looking back, there's a great sort of quote from him, sort of like reflecting back, I think when he was 101, right at the end of his life. And he basically came to view that the most important role of LSD and of psychedelics is to kind of reconnect us with the natural world, that we've become detached through our sort of materialistic success and sort of dominance, and like we urgently need to regain our connection to it, and LSD and other psychedelics can help with that. In terms of natural versus like, you know, synthetic, semi-synthetic, is an interesting question, and I would personally say like certainly like LSD can very much, there's no doubting its power to reconnect us to nature. But I think, you know, when you're kind of on it, you maybe, I'm aware anyway that I've ingested something that's not, it's leaning towards being in nature, you know, because it mostly is. It's a semi-synthetic. It's a lot more natural. It's an important thing to remember. Like, it's a semi-synthetic molecule. Although it's made in a lab, its actual molecular structure is much more natural than synthetic. It's only like a minor sort of tweaking that's making it a kind of synthetic molecule. But I think there's something to be said for actually ingesting something directly, like a mushroom or an ayahuasca or cactus, you know, something that's come from the earth and you're ingesting it. And I think there's that, even if it's just a kind of psychosomatic thing, just the ritualistic act of ingesting some part of nature, I think can also kind of like catalyze with that. I mean, no, certainly I've had like nature connection experiences. I don't know. I would have to sort of, I'm going on my own experiences. I think psilocybin mushrooms do seem particularly powerful at kind of like deeply reconnecting me to nature.
Yeah, and I always kind of come back to this thing or this comment that Albert Hoffman made about like the difference between LSD and psilocybin, and he, you know, mentioned, you know, psilocybin, there's something animate in there, like it's just a
Yeah,
little strange, and so I always think about those qualities. I'm thinking about some of my own experiences early on and how kind of, yeah, like what there's like something sometimes communicating in there.
yeah. No, it's interesting, isn't it? The phenomenology of these things, and I know what you mean. I'd kind of say, like, for me, the thing that's interesting and useful about, I guess, LSD is it's kind of like a clear mirror.
Hmm.
It's not really imparting too much of its own sort of agenda, I guess you could say. Like, I have to be careful with like what words I use here. It's kind of like a clear mirror, which and a sort of amplifying means of sort of amplifying things, which can be really useful in its own way. Whereas, like, it seems like the plants and like the mushrooms and the ayahuasca, they all seem to have more of a overt sort of like, I don't know, character, personality, or agenda, if you like.
Yeah.
You know, there's sort of like their own sort of vibe in the mix as well, and it can seem definitely more sort of animated and mysterious and yeah, maybe deeper in some ways as well, perhaps. So yeah, no, I do think that the organic psychedelics are sort of particularly geared towards this nature reconnection, but I certainly don't want to in any way badmouth LSD, because it can be powerful
Oh yeah,
catalyst regard
for
too.
sure.
But
Yeah, just interesting things to think about.
yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, no, lots of interesting terrain.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned in the TED talk I was watching earlier that there might be a correlation between rigid egos and nature disconnection. And I think you brought that up a little bit ago as well. But it would make sense, right? If we're looking at like the neuroscience and looking how psilocybin decreases blood flow to the default mode network, kind of deactivates that a little bit. And, you're having this, non-egoic experience. It's starting to
Yeah.
and
Well, yeah, it's the thing of, so we know, kind of a rigid ego, seems to be linked to depression. And the useful thing about psilocybin or a psychedelic experience is it can like sort of shake off the shackles of that rigid ego and sort of like loosen things up a bit. And the ego's, not to badmouth the ego, because it's absolutely got its place. It's what gets us through our lives and our day and lets us gets us doing stuff, achieving stuff, but it can become a kind of tyrannical dictator as well if it's too entrenched and too rigid. And it seems like, yeah, there's a capacity there when it is too rigid. It can sort of wall us off and disconnect us. Firstly, this connection, I mean this in a kind of very broad way. So firstly, disconnected from ourselves, from aspects of ourself. And the disconnection can also span to other people. We can be disconnected from our friends and family and other humans and other beings, I guess. And then, to expand on it further, there's our potential disconnection from the world at large, from nature, from the universe. And it seems like kind of the rigidity of the ego could be a factor in that, and that's something that psychedelics can sometimes address.
Yeah. You're bringing up connection with ourselves and what with the ego. It made me think about something you said as well. When we're kind of destroying our own homes and the nature and environment, are we actually falling out of love with ourselves? And that seems like a really important thing, right? How in touch
Yeah.
are we with ourselves, and how that might ripple out to how we're in touch with other people and the natural world around us.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting sort of point. If you kind of like, well, firstly, like there's, I think the state of like deep samadhi that people, talk about in sort of advanced, like spiritual or like Eastern religious states, where there's a complete dissolution of boundaries and you feel like you come to the experiential conclusion that it's all you, in a sense, as in like a capital Y you, like it's all just one thing of which you're a part. So there's no inside and outside or self and other. It's all one cohesive whole. So that's something to bear in mind. And then of course many different indigenous cultures, they have this very deep connection to their land, where it's kind of can sometimes be felt as a sort of as an extension of them. So by destroying the land and by harming the land, you are in effect harming yourself. And that's why I think the psychedelics are interesting in our kind of like more materialistic, individualistic, egoic society, is that their power is that they can kind of bring us into that sort of like state of being where self and nature do overlap and do appear as a single cohesive whole. So they can kind of like catalyze that sort of insight that other cultures have sort of known about and are part of their embedded worldviews and have been for a very long time.
Yeah, makes me think about like sometimes in like therapy and whatnot, like people really focusing on external factors, and really how when you start to cultivate more of that like self-awareness and self-love, how that could also influence the external factors. Instead of blaming everything that's happening to you, how do you find more of a, I guess, self-love and peace within, so then you can actually change your perception around possibly what's going on, actually make other changes.
Yeah. No, and it's interesting, and it seems like part of the sort of the psychedelic, the therapeutic effect, at least from some of the imperial case studies of people, is like you get this kind of zoomed out like overview effect that the astronauts talk about when they see the Earth from space, and like they have this powerful cognitive shift of where they see like the unity and the interconnection of life on this fragile, very beautiful world, and like the universal brotherhood of human beings, and forever sort of changes them. And it seems like with part of this psychedelics therapeutic effect can be through you zoom out so much that you realize that your problems, and that they are problems and shouldn't be like sniffed at. We've all got our problems in life and stuff, but in the grand scheme of things, they're really quite small, in terms of like the universe, the cosmos, and the planet. And that in itself can be like a positive, empowering thing to experience firsthand, like how small in relative terms your problems actually are, even if they seem quite serious. They're in the grand scheme actually maybe not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting even thinking about astronauts looking at the Earth. I mean, every time I fly, for example, I even feel that flying over big cities and just thinking like, wow, like I wonder what's going on down there, and just kind of being curious and be like, wow.
I think it's really interesting, and I think it would be, so the overview effect is a really quite powerful thing for many of the astronauts that experience it, and it really stays with them. Again, it's a very enduring shift, and I think it would kind of really affect our species and our civilization if we could all have that experience, and maybe sometime in the future, but obviously not that many of us are going to have the opportunity of going to space and looking down on the planet. But the thing I think is interesting about psychedelics is they're perhaps a different route to essentially the same destination.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? So that's exciting and interesting. Like we can sort of through them introduce this kind of overview perspective without sort of the need of going to space in a sense. And so I think that's a sort of interesting positive property they have.
If psychedelics became legalized or decriminalized, how would you see these tools like being implemented? In the sense of like being able to cultivate more connection with nature. Like, what type of frameworks could you see in the future?
Wow, yeah, that's an interesting question. So, I mean, in terms of like, at least with the medicalization, I think we're going to see like the rise of psychedelic sort of therapy healing clinics. I think that's there'll be special places where we've trained therapists and staff there for like the safe supervision of psychedelic experiences, and that will sort of be one model that probably takes off and does quite well. I guess that's a kind of legalized, that's a sort of medical model in particular. In terms of the decriminalization model, I mean, it's sort of like, it's interesting here, at least in the UK, we're seeing like psychedelic societies are kind of like cropping up in all the major sort of cities. So like there's an increasing community building going on where like members of like the psychedelic community or people who are interested in psychedelics are coming together increasingly, and they're sharing content and they're connecting and they're talking, and so there's that's all sort of happening. And I think out of that, communities and different projects and initiatives and things will catalyze from that. I'm not quite sure in what forms that will take, but it seems that again, and that it's the internet party that's sort of bringing people together in that way. So who knows? I mean, I would like to see, in some sense, like it'd be great to have some kind of like reconnection clinics or something along those like, not, I don't know, clinic sounds a bit clinical. So reconnection centers or sort of like somewhere like that people sort of can go and they can learn these different sort of practices, techniques of consciousness alteration, and sort of like, hopefully kind of in a sense rewild themselves, and by doing so sort of like play a part in rewilding and restoring the wider environment. And I think there's a great sort of potential therapeutic modality is like, get outside and like plant some trees, and maybe pick some litter out of a stream, like grow a vegetable patch. I think like I do sort of suspect that a fair bit of the rise of depression and anxiety that we're, the mental health crisis really that we're experiencing in the Western world is a side effect of our nature disconnected lifestyles. And we could sort of it'd really help to sort of actively play a role in not only connecting ourselves to nature, but like play a role in actually restoring nature. And I think that's a really interesting potential therapeutic modality. Like we can sort of like, use the pro-environmental awareness we may have gained to play an active role in restoring nature, and through that, in part, restore ourselves. I mean, like, eco-anxiety is kind of a term that's I keep hearing more and more about. Like people seem to be increasingly anxious about climate change and the state of the environment. And here in the UK, we're worried about nature deficit disorder in our children. They're like so deprived of nature. Like there was a few surveys, a few sort of done the last few years, and one of them found that school kids, I think 8-year-old kids, they were better at identifying Pokemon characters than just common wildlife species. And even more kind of worrying, this survey comparing prisoners and kids found that on average this population of kids that they sampled spent less time outside than prison inmates, much to the horror of the prisoners.
Wow.
And that's less than an hour a week. So it's that's pretty scary, both for our sort of the individual well-being of those children and sort of like the wider environment as well. Because like if you're not connected to something, if you're not connected to or have appreciation for something, you're sure as hell aren't going to protect it or preserve it. Good. Right. So we really need to remedy that.
Yeah. In terms of the mental health crisis, I think I remember, I don't know where this was, might have been on an article or in Psychology Today or something like that, but the younger generation kind of coming into therapy, dealing with climate grief and just this like anxiety. And you just brought that up and just remind me about that this is an issue I think a lot of people are starting to become anxious about, and like, what can we do? Like, how is this really going to affect us down the line, or, future generations? And we might be the ones have to deal with it, or if we don't, then the future generations.
It does seem there's an increase, like some of the younger people now, obviously like Greta Thunberg is someone who's thinks about, but there's increased activism among the young, like, who are being handed this world by the older generation that's not really done much to sort of like help things. Like, yes, there's maybe some evidence that there's some deck chair polishing and rearranging going on the Titanic, but there's not really much concerted effort to steer it away from the rapidly melting iceberg that we're heading towards. And so I can kind of empathize with those younger people who are really quite concerned and stressed and anxious about sort of the lack of action that's going on. And I think I worry that that's partly a result of the brains we've inherited from our Paleolithic ancestors. Like pretty much all life on this planet, including us, is primed to react to very short-term threats, immediate threats to its existence. So when we have a longer term threat, particularly something like climate change, which is I think hard for people to kind of visualize in a way. It's a sort of like not a concrete thing. It can be hard to visualize, and sort of it's a very complex, multifaceted thing as well. And I think because it's kind of a long-term process, it doesn't elicit the same fear as, say, a saber-toothed cat that's about to jump on you and eat you. Do you know what I mean? So people are like, well, it's not really my problem. It's like, well, a little bit is, even if you don't think it is. And it is just because you can't quite see it or sort of conceptually maybe grasp it in a really sort of concrete way doesn't mean it's not a threat. So we need to transcend that. We need to kind of transcend our own evolutionary psychological wiring, basically, which is also tough.
A meditation I always kind of think about is like, if reincarnation is real, what type of world would I want to come back to? You know, do I want to
Yeah,
come back to a shit show and, oh wow,
yeah,
I played a role in that to my own future, you know?
yeah. No, that's a nice way of putting it. I know there's some sort of members of the sort of astral projecting out of body exploring community, and they feel that your consciousness does come back sort of uh, again and again, because it's interesting. Some people make the point, like religion's not particularly helpful, because if you think that this is your one physical life and then you're going to go to the eternal afterlife, so who cares about what happens here? It's like, whereas that perspective that you just described, and the perspective of these guys is like, you do come back, so you damn well want to look after the physical plane here, because future installments of yourself will be coming back in again, and you don't want it to be getting worse and worse and worse. If anything, it'd be nice if it was getting better and better and better. That would be a nicer thing to work towards.
Yeah, and I guess coming back to like the framework thing too is, it's interesting if we are kind of in this crisis right now and it's going to get worse. How accessible is the medical model going to be for most people? We hear that it's going to be quite expensive, or maybe you might not be able to meet inclusion criteria. And what are these other frameworks that could be really helpful for maybe speeding up like the this capacity to connect and hopefully create more of a cultural and global change over time?
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, psychedelics themselves are already going to be, I feel, and other researchers feel, that there will be sort of paradigm shifting for psychiatry and medicine, because they're just so radically different to any other medicines or drugs that we use. I mean, they're completely unique in that, all other drugs and medicines are active while they're in your system, and then they're not once your body kind of excretes it. Whereas psychedelics, you have this experience, and sometimes you can have a very profound experience, and that experience stays with you and then informs sort of how you go about your life from then on, in a sense. And that's sort of like quite radical, in that a single or a few acute experiences can lead to this long-term shift in outlook, in personality, and in well-being. And the other really interesting thing I think about psychedelics, and I think there will be more research sort of looking at this, is that it's not just it's not just people with mental health issues that can benefit from them. It seems like, to quote one sort of researcher, that they can lead to the betterment of well people. They can have benefits to people who are otherwise healthy. And like, I feel that this nature connection, relatedness, environmental awareness is very much an important part of that. I think it's applicable to sort of to most or all humans, irrespective of your overall health and stuff. But
so psychedelics are still legal in lots of places. So do you have any tips and advice on non-drug substance related ways to get in touch with nature, and what could people do to start to maybe cultivate more of a relationship with nature?
So good question. So I mean, firstly, just to say, like, the direct physical sensory experience of nature is well known to increase nature connection or relatedness. So just getting out into nature, that's already more than half the battle already won. So get out into nature and do whatever you like to do in nature, like walking, trekking, running, biking, beekeeping, gardening, like sailing, like any activity that kind of like floats your boat, that gets you out there. Go and make some time for that, and that's a good start. I think particularly the art of Japanese forest bathing, Shinrin Yoku, and I'm going to actually do a practitioner course of this in some woods down south in the UK. Cool. In August, and I'm quite intrigued by that, because it's kind of like, I think it's fairly sort of like chilled out as activities go. It's effectively like you walk around woodlands, and there's maybe a bit of breath work involved, and you're quite mindful and you take it in. And it seems like could have, and there's an increasing body of research to say there's a number of health benefits to doing that. And I think it could be a great tool to sort of teach people post psychedelic, so they have a sort of way of following their like psychedelic experiences, when they might feel more nature connected, they've got a sort of a practice that they can do that's quite easy and accessible and non-threatening, and they can do it in nature. So it's interesting to note that mindfulness and nature connection are reciprocal and synergistic. The researchers found. So the more mindful you are, the more nature connected you tend to feel, and vice versa. So Shinrin Yoku is interesting because it kind of cultivates mindfulness in a natural environment. So you're kind of getting two for the price of one, in a sense. So yeah, so practices that cultivate mindfulness, like meditation, they will help in terms of connection. So in terms of other practices, yeah, it's a good question. So like, I wonder about sort of like different things in terms of breath work and sort of the potentials of that. I'm sure there are other kind of like practices of consciousness exploration, alteration that could be useful. I mean, it does seem from the case of psychedelics, it's linked particularly to the ego dissolution experiences. So other approaches that can sort of work on loosening, relaxing, and dissolving the ego could well be sort of worth exploring, I think.
Right. Yeah. There's so many different ways to get in touch. And I think it's sometimes more simple than it is, like it's so easy to get caught up in everything that we do, our lives, our jobs, and this and that. And, I've been trying to spend more time in doing the things I enjoy, and, getting back on my bike and being able to just ride down in the woods and stuff like that. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, I forget how much I love this. I just haven't made
Yeah.
time for it. And just being able to
Yeah.
step away from everything and kind of consciously create that time to connect with yourself. And
yeah. No, I know exactly what you mean. I don't, I'm sometimes really busy and I don't get to like spend the time in nature that I want to and feel like I really should. Yeah, there was another point I was just going to, I had there, but I think it's been lost to the shifting
maybe it'll
sounds of
come
my
back.
mind. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're about over an hour. I'm wondering if there's anything else that you wanted to touch on about your work or your research really quick. Anything else that you wanted to highlight?
Just having a little think. I think we've sort of kind of covered the main sort of bases there. I mean, it's been really interesting this year. I've noticed there's a lot of this kind of nature connection theme has sort of come up, and there's definitely an interesting growing awareness and an interest in it. So I've been kind of doing a few talks at festivals and at conferences, and it's been really good sort of being able to kind of like talk about this stuff, and then like linking up with other minds, other people who are sort of also kind of on that level. So it's quite heartening actually to see a growing awareness and interest in this. And I just hope, I guess a hope for me is like right now, this is kind of like, to some extent, it's a kind of it's a single facet of the psychedelic experience that's being looked at and studied. And I would hope moving forward, given it's like huge importance for individual well-being and the sort of societal or biosphere well-being, like it would be great, I think, to see more focused research looking at this specifically, and as psychedelics as kind of biophilia enhancing or nature connecting agents. I think it's interesting and it's important and worthy of more research, definitely.
Awesome. And I think you might be one of the first or few people that we had from the Beckley Foundation on. And I'm wondering, any exciting things on the horizon or anything that the Beckley Foundation's doing that's going on right now you want to pitch?
So there is some exciting things on the horizon. I think a fair chunk of them might be confidential, and I'm not allowed to discuss them. I'm known for being a bit of a blunderbuss when it comes to stuff. So I'm gonna like be cautious in terms of what I say. But no, there is some interesting stuff in the pipeline. Like, I'm particularly fascinated. I think I mentioned earlier we've helped fund a study at Imperial College where they're they're looking at the effects of psilocybin in psychedelic naive healthy people. So they're taking healthy people who've never taken a psychedelic and they're giving them a high dose of psilocybin. and they're looking at their brains before, I think immediately after, and then maybe a month later, and then they're doing longer term sort of qualitative assessments, so personality, well-being, life satisfaction, nature relatedness. And yeah, I'm probably not at liberty to divulge because it's unpublished. So it's the
Yeah,
MRI
totally
data
fine.
being analysed now, and it's hopefully will be published later in the year. But the results from that, I'm particularly excited about, because there's been a lot of research on sort of, focus on like major depression and sort of PTSD, obviously with MDMA, and addiction as well with psilocybin, which is obviously very important, valuable research. But I'm quite interested now in seeing some more research on the effects of the long-term effects of psychedelics in otherwise healthy people, because that's going to bring some sort of new light to the stage, I think, that's going to kind of catalyze things further in terms of what's happening now on the stage, the global stage of this stuff. So that's quite exciting. And yeah, we're involved with some psychedelic microdosing research as well. That's a sort of major interest of my boss, Amanda Fielding. So a lot of quite a few of the psychedelic microdosing studies that are either underway or planned, that the Beckley is heavily involved with in instigating and funding. So that's exciting as well. And then, yeah, there are a few other sort of potential interesting plans that are kind of currently existing in a state of quantum potentiality, and others are sort of moving forward as well. But I don't think I can yet say anything about.
Totally
But
fine.
yes, interesting stuff, I can definitely say is in the pipeline.
Awesome. And you also are going to be speaking at breaking conventions coming up in August.
Yes, I am. I'm going to essentially probably give a condensed version of this podcast in presentation format, I think.
So if you don't
But
have
yeah,
your ticket to breaking convention, go get a ticket and
yeah, it's a fantastic, amazing event. I've been 4 times. I've spoken at the last 3, and I love it. I've sort of made some very, very good friends there, and it's just like although it's a conference, it feels a bit more like a festival type like vibe there, and it's just it attracts such an interesting, eclectic. Having been to academic conferences as part of my PhD and stuff, it attracts a very sort of eclectic, expansive crowd of very interesting people working in different fields, all with their own sort of perspectives on the whole psychedelic thing. So not an event to be missed, I think.
Awesome. Any last advice, words of wisdom?
Well, I guess sort of, to just crystallize it. Make some time for nature in whatever way pleasures you and sort of like works for you. Like, it's really, really good for you as an individual. Like, it's as important as exercise, as like any of the big important determinants of health. There was a study, I think, published in Nature quite recently, and it found that 2 hours of nature time a week are profoundly health protective. And it doesn't matter the type of nature. It can be like urban parkland. It doesn't have to be pristine wilderness by any stretch. Any kind of green space will effectively do. It doesn't matter if you get the dosage in 2 hours in one go or spread over the course of a week. And it doesn't matter. You don't have to be moving around in it either. You can just literally be sitting there taking it in. It's just like they actually control for the exercise. Say if dog walkers being in nature, they kind of controlled for that in their analysis. So simply being in nature is really good. So yeah, make some time for nature. Like it's so important for you as an individual. And like the only way we're going to sort of like have a long-term future that is worth striving for and having is through reconnecting to nature and remembering our love for it, and our need to like preserve and protect it as effectively an extension of ourselves, which essentially it is.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Gandy. Appreciate this conversation. So important. And I guess one last
Thank you.
thing, can people find you online anywhere? Do you social media presence or anything?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm on Facebook. People are welcome to email me, greensam2512@hotmail.com. I'm on Twitter at Samwise Gandhi. Yeah, so people are very welcome to drop me a line and connect.
Awesome. Thanks, Dr. Gandy. This has been awesome.
Cool.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It's been really fun. Been great chatting. Thanks a lot, Carl.